Hello everybody, welcome to the Whiskey Dictionary. There's this large gap of knowledge that I think a lot of us whiskey reviewers just assume. We assume that you know about whiskey finishing. Now, whiskey finishing isn't a very complicated concept, but there is a lot of variance to it, and it's something worth talking about. So rather than assume anything, I'd rather just talk about it. So, join me here, pour a glass, try to find something finished, and let's talk and learn about whiskey finishing. Whiskey finishing, or cask finishing, is when you take a whiskey that's already matured in its original container, typically an ex-bourbon barrel, and then you transfer it into a secondary container that has previously held something else, and then you go on to your bottling. Now that something else is usually going to be something like sherry, or port, or even beer. It could be a number of different things, and we'll talk about those a little later on. But the reason that you might want to do this is to add complexity to your flavor of your whiskey. And a good way to think about this, think about marinating steak tips. Now, steak is amazing, right? So I would guarantee you that 99% of the people watching a whiskey channel enjoy a steak. But if you like steak tips and you marinate them, they're typically going to taste better. You're adding complexity, you're adding layers to your flavor. And that's pretty much what you're doing when you're finishing whiskey. It's a way to change the flavor of your whiskey just a little bit so it becomes something new. Okay, so you can add some complexity by finishing your whiskey. That makes perfect sense, and that is one of the main reasons that people would finish a whiskey. However, some of the other reasons are very obvious if you stop to think about it. You can take a younger whiskey which has some harsher elements, and you can hide those real well by rounding them off by finishing them in a barrel of, say, sherry or rum. You can really hide those younger flavors. So now you have 5-year-old Scotch that you can sell for $80 because it's limited edition. And that's another reason. A lot of times distilleries will want to experiment. They will want to finish these things in random barrels from some random place. They'll call it a limited edition, they'll sell it for a lot more, and everybody wins. We get something new, they get a lot more money. So, the other one, and kind of probably where this first came from, is sometimes the whiskey just doesn't age right. If you have an 18-year-old Scotch and it just doesn't taste like what you want to charge for an $18 Scotch, you can go finish that Scotch and you can recover that barrel. That is a very obvious way and very often exercised way of finishing a whiskey. Not all finishes are created equal, and there's some that are far more common than others. For example, sherry is by far the most common thing to finish your whiskey. And sherry is a fortified wine from Spain, but it can take on a lot of different flavors depending on which kind it is. For example, Oloroso Sherry casks give kind of a deeper, nutty, raisin, dried fruits, kind of dark chocolate flavor, such as the Bunab in 12. This is a great example of a second and third fill Oloroso Sherry, but it's still there. Then you have Pedro Ximénez or PX Sherry. This is going to be more kind of sweeter, molasses, figs, jams, things like that. You have the Laphroaig Carchis 2021 and the Aberlour Abuna. These are great examples, but you can find a lot of PX Sherry casks. Then there's the Fino Sherry casks, which are lighter, crisper, they taste kind of like green apple and almond, and there's not a whole lot of these around, but the couple of examples I found are Kilchoman and Glenillicky. Then there's Amontillado and Manzanilla casks. I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Manzanilla, but if it's not, feel free to tell me in the comments. The Amontillado ends up tasting a lot like Oloroso Sherry, and in fact, I only have one of these on hand, and even this is barely. This is from Broken Barrel, who literally breaks up barrels and uses the staves to help influence the whiskey. So very, very rare. I don't have any Manzanilla. Now we're going to talk about port finishes, and if you want your whiskey to taste like a dessert, this is the way you want to go. So there's a couple of different styles. You have ruby port, then you have tawny port. Now ruby port is very similar to the way it sounds. It's kind of like, you would probably think that's more of a fruit forward kind of thing, something a little sweeter, and that's exactly what it is. Then you have tawny port, which, similar to the sherry where we had some of the fruitier ones and then the deeper, darker ones, that's what tawny port. It's going to be more like a dried fruit kind of flavor as well as nuttier. Now I have a few different options here. I have the Dalmore Port Reserve, this is a Scotch. Then we have Tyrconnell, which is an Irish whiskey finished in port. Then I also have this kind of old one. I haven't touched this one in a long time. Glenmoray Port Finished. This is not that great, if I'm being honest. And then we have the Angel's Envy, which I'm sure you recognize this one. This is a port finished bourbon. And we're going to talk about the labeling later on in the video, just because there are a bunch of laws, but we won't spend a ton of time on that because, frankly, talking about laws is a little boring. But let's go on to rum casks. If you're looking to add a little bit of a tropical flavor to your whiskey, you might think about rum cask finishes. However, I would tell you from my personal experience, I don't think rum cask really holds up to whiskeys. It just doesn't do what you'd think it would do. Like, rum has a very good flavor, usually sweet, kind of molasses, brown sugar, something like that. And it just doesn't do that to the whiskey, in my opinion, very well. But that being said, there are a couple different types. There's Caribbean rum casks as well as Jamaican rum casks. Now, Jamaican rum casks, we'll talk about this first because they're a little weird. They taste a little funky and almost like over-ripened fruits, as well as maybe like a little nuttiness. And just none of that strikes me as rum. So then you have Caribbean rum, which much more so. It's like molasses and brown sugar and sweetness and just kind of like a coconutty feel. So both of those are the main kinds, and I have a couple of different examples. This one you might not have seen before. This is the Pike Creek. This is a Canadian whiskey that's finished in rum casks. It's not bad. Then you have the Teeling Small Batch. This one is finished in rum casks, and I love this one, but not for its rum influence, just because it's a really good Teeling. And then if you watch this channel a lot, you'll actually see this whiskey in a couple of days as the review I'm going to be doing. This is the Caribbean Rum Finished Glenlivet, and it is fine. Watch the review. All right, let's go on to wine casks. Just to show you the breadth of finishing whiskeys just among my own collection here, I pulled out a few just to show you. So this is a Chardonnay cask by Glen Moray. Honestly, not that great, but I like that they tried it. Then you have a Tale of Cake, which is Tokaji dessert wine. I've been told I say that word wrong, so I apologize if I did. Then we also have a Madeira. We have a Marsala. Then we have, actually, these are cool. So another thing you could do is you could actually finish using beer. So Jameson did a thing a couple of years ago where they finished some whiskey in stout and IPA casks. Now, I liked the stout one quite a bit more than the IPA. A lot of people like it either one or the other. They don't tend to like both, which is interesting. If you've tried these before, tell me which one you like more. But in general, you can kind of do whatever you want. And that's going to bring us a little bit to some of the laws. Now, thankfully, the laws around all of this stuff are mercifully easy to understand. Scotch typically is one of the most restrictive when it comes to what you can do with your whiskey, but not when it comes to finishing. In fact, they allow you to do pretty much anything as long as what's in the barrel beforehand isn't artificially flavored or just a really heavy flavor that's not akin to Scotch. For example, maple syrup wouldn't fly. So, when it comes to bourbon, though, they actually have a little bit more stringency. So, like, a lot of those scotches, they don't necessarily put that it's finished in something, although they often will because it's a point of pride or a point of intent. But in the case of bourbon, you have to. So this is Angel's Envy. It says Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey finished in port wine barrels. That's right there on the front, and if they didn't have that, that would be a problem. Everything else, from rye to American single malts, in general, just put it on the bottle and you're good to go. Irish whiskey is very similar. Put it on the bottle and you're good to go. And the rules around like Japanese whiskey, they really want you to put it on the bottle, but things are still in a little bit of a flux there, so I wouldn't be surprised if something got sneaky. This has been everything that there is to know about finishing whiskey. In general, one thing that you might have been wondering is, like, how long do you finish whiskey? And the reason I didn't touch on that too much is because it can vary considerably. You can do 10 minutes if you really wanted to, or you could do multiple years. And the longer that you leave it in the barrel, the more intense the flavor should get. But the cool thing here is almost as soon as your whiskey touches something it's finishing, the nose on those things explode. And it can make a really, really good smelling whiskey. All right, thank you very much for joining me here on the Whiskey Dictionary. I hope you have a great rest of your night. I hope you enjoy what you're drinking, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.